Joyce never imagined that the man who would break her heart was the same man who made her believe in fairy tales. But that's how love works sometimes, isn't it? It builds you up so high that when you fall, the landing shatters everything you thought you knew about yourself. This is a story about passion, pressure, and the cruel irony of wanting something so badly that you destroy the very thing that could give it to you. This is the story of how a millionaire CEO got exactly what he wished for, just not in the way he expected. Des Moines, Iowa. Not exactly the place you'd expect a love story to ignite, especially not one that would test the very meaning of commitment, culture, and the price we pay for our deepest desires. Joyce was a talented African-American artist from Chicago, a woman who painted the world in bold strokes and vibrant colors. She'd left behind the familiar chaos of the windy city for something quieter, something that promised a fresh start. The local art gallery had offered her a position she couldn't refuse, and so she packed her life into boxes and headed for the heartland, where the skies stretched endlessly and the pace of life felt like a deep breath after years of holding it in. She was searching for inspiration. What she found instead was a love that would nearly destroy her. It happened on a crisp autumn evening at the Des Moines Art Center. The charity auction was in full swing, champagne glasses clinking, wealthy donors admiring paintings they'd never truly understand. Joyce was working the room, her warm smile drawing people in as she explained the stories behind each piece. She had this gift, you see, the ability to make art come alive, to make strangers feel something deeper than the price tags suggested. And that's when she felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of her neck. Someone was watching her. James stood across the gallery floor in a sharp, tailored suit that screamed success. He was a real estate CEO, a self-made millionaire who turned Iowa farmland and downtown developments into a fortune most people only dreamed about. Tall, confident, white, and born into one of Des Moines' most prominent families. He'd come to the auction as a sponsor, intending only to write a check and leave. But the moment he spotted Joyce, something shifted. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was stunning. It was the way she moved through the world, with this infectious energy, this genuine warmth that made everyone around her lean in closer. James felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt captivated. Now, James wasn't the kind of man who hesitated. In business, hesitation meant losing deals. So he crossed that gallery floor with purpose, weaving through the crowd until he reached the refreshment table where Joyce stood. What started as polite conversation about a landscape painting quickly became something more. They discovered they both loved jazz, the old-school kind, Miles Davis and John Coltrane. They both believed in working hard for what they wanted. They both had big dreams for the future. By the end of the night, James couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just met someone truly special. Before Joyce could slip away, he asked her to dinner. She said yes. Neither of them knew they'd just set something irreversible into motion. Dating across different worlds in Iowa came with its challenges, but for James and Joyce, it became a journey of beautiful discovery. Joyce brought James into her culture. Sunday services at a black church where gospel choirs shook the rafters and filled your chest with something holy, followed by Sunday dinners at her aunt's house where soul food and laughter were served in equal measure. Her family was surprised at first. A white man? Really? But James showed up with respect and genuine interest. He learned to appreciate collard greens and cornbread, asked questions about their traditions, and his earnest efforts earned him not just acceptance, but affection. They saw how he looked at their Joyce, like she hung the moon. In return, James opened doors to his world. He came from old Iowa money, the kind of family whose name appeared on buildings and in historical societies. One summer afternoon, he brought Joyce to his parents' sprawling farmhouse. Estate, generations of family history embedded in every beam and floorboard. Joyce felt the weight of curious stares from the mostly white conservative crowd. She noticed the polite smiles that didn't quite reach certain eyes. But James never left her side. He introduced her proudly as the woman I love, and though some relatives remained reserved, his devotion was unmistakable. Later, when they were alone, he asked if she was okay. Joyce squeezed his hand and told him she could handle it. And she could, because what they had was worth fighting for. Over the next year, they became inseparable. Romance bloomed in the small moments. James slow dancing with Joyce in their living room to their favorite. Jazz records, Joyce tucking sweet handwritten notes into his briefcase before business trips. It was the kind of love that felt effortless, the kind that made you believe you could conquer anything together. So when James dropped to one knee during a picnic at a beautiful park, Joyce didn't hesitate. Through tears of joy, she said yes. They talked about their future constantly, their careers, their dreams, and yes, the family they'd build together. At that moment, with the ring sparkling on her finger and James's arms wrapped around her, neither of them could have imagined that the very dream they shared would become the weapon that tore them apart. After the wedding, those conversations about children shifted from dreamy to urgent. James was in his mid-30s now, and something had changed in him. Maybe it was his parents' gentle hints at family gatherings, their wistful glances at other people's grandchildren. Maybe it was watching his friends become fathers. Whatever it was, James felt this deep, almost primal yearning to be a dad. He wanted it now. Joyce wanted children too, absolutely. But she'd just been promoted at the gallery. She'd launched this incredible youth art outreach program for underprivileged kids, pouring her heart into giving them opportunities she wished she'd had. "We have time," she'd tell him, holding his hand, trying to make him understand. "I want to have a baby with you too, James. Just not yet." At first he agreed to wait, but as the months passed, James's longing only intensified, fed by pressure from every direction. And Joyce, because she loved him, because she wanted him happy, eventually gave in sooner than she'd planned. They started trying for a baby. What began with hope and excitement, though, was about to become their undoing. Because here's what nobody tells you about wanting something desperately. Sometimes the wanting itself poisons everything else. Month after month, negative pregnancy tests. Month after month, disappointment turning to frustration, turning to something darker. The intimacy they once shared spontaneously became scheduled, clinical, weighted down by the pressure of an unmet goal. Joyce consulted doctors, changed her diet, held on to hope, even as she felt James pulling away. And then came the night that changed everything. Another negative test, another month of failure, and finally, words spoken in anger and pain that could never be taken back. So here's the question I want you to think about. When love collides with unfulfilled dreams, when the pressure to have what we want overrides the value of what we already have, can a relationship survive? Or are some words, once spoken, simply too devastating to overcome? The bathroom light seemed harsher than usual that evening, casting shadows that made everything feel colder, more clinical. Joyce stood there, staring at another negative pregnancy test, and for the first time in their relationship, she felt truly alone, even though her husband was just on the other side of the door. Nearly a year of trying, nearly a year of hope turning to disappointment, of intimacy that once felt like an expression of love becoming nothing more than a scheduled obligation. She could hear James pacing in the bedroom, and she knew what was coming. You can feel it, can't you? That moment when the air in a room changes, when you know that whatever happens next will alter the course of everything. Joyce took a deep breath, opened the door, and walked out with tears streaming down her face, and that damning piece of plastic in her trembling hand. "Not this month either," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James's face fell. She watched the disappointment wash over him like a wave, watched his jaw tighten, watched his hands clench into fists at his sides. And then something inside him snapped. "It shouldn't be this hard," he burst out, his voice strained with frustration he'd been holding back for months. "We've done everything. We've seen doctors, we've timed everything perfectly, we've tried every suggestion they've given us. I just don't understand why." He caught himself, but it was too late. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. "Why I can't get pregnant." Joyce finished for him, her voice cracking. "Is that what you were going to say, James? Watch what happens when pressure builds for too long. Watch what happens when two people who love each other forget how to communicate anything except their disappointment." James ran his hand through his hair, A gesture Joyce had once found endearing, but now seemed like a sign of his exasperation. With her, with their situation, with everything they'd become. "That's not what I meant," he said, softer this time, "but the damage was already done. I just always imagined by now we'd have a baby. I thought we'd be parents already. I thought—" "You thought it would be easy," Joyce interrupted, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. "You thought you could just decide you wanted something and it would happen. Because that's how everything else in your life works, isn't it? You want a deal, you close it. You want a property, you buy it. You want a baby. And suddenly your wife becomes a problem to be solved. Joyce, please." "I'm trying my best, James." Her voice rose now, all the pain and inadequacy she'd been swallowing for months finally erupting. "Do you think this isn't killing me too? Do you think I enjoy feeling like a failure every single month? This isn't either of our faults. It just takes time sometimes." James sighed, a sound heavy with anguish and something else, something that sounded dangerously close to resignation. The silence between them felt suffocating. Finally, he spoke, and his words would haunt both of them for years to come. "Maybe we should consider other options," he said quietly. "Like a specialist or IVF or something." That hesitation, that tiny pause before something. Joyce's stomach twisted because she knew exactly what he meant. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he wouldn't quite meet her gaze. "Or someone else?" she asked, her voice bitter. "Is that what you mean by other options, James? Someone else who can give you what you want?" James looked away, and in that moment of averted eyes, Joyce saw her worst fears confirmed. The man standing before her, the man she'd married, the man she'd rearranged her entire life for, he was actually considering a future without her, because she couldn't give him the one thing he'd decided mattered most. "I just want to be a dad, Joyce." His voice was barely a whisper now. "I don't know if it's going to happen with us. Have you ever felt the exact moment your heart breaks? Not the slow crack that comes from gradual disappointment, but the sudden, catastrophic, shattering when someone you love tells you that you're not enough." That's what Joyce felt, as if James had reached into her chest and crushed everything that made her believe in their love. "So, the problem is us now," she exclaimed, her voice rising with hurt and anger. "Not the timing, not the medical realities, not the fact that these things sometimes just take longer. The problem is us. I thought love could get us through anything, James. I thought that's what marriage meant. Apparently, I was wrong. Apparently, your love has conditions I didn't know about." "Don't twist my words," James snapped back, his own frustration finally overcoming whatever tact he'd been trying to maintain. "I love you, but I'm losing hope here. Maybe love isn't enough when all our efforts keep failing. Maybe—" He stopped himself, but Joyce finished the thought in her own mind. "Maybe you're not the one. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I need to find someone else who can give me what I want." A cold, terrible silence fell over them. Joyce's hands trembled. The man standing before her suddenly felt like a stranger. How had they gotten here? How had the man who once slow danced with her in their living room, who wrote her love notes, who stood proudly by her side, when his family had reservations, how had that man become this person who was basically telling her she was disposable? "If that's how you feel," Joyce said quietly, her voice steady despite the devastation coursing through her, "then I can't help you. I won't stay in a marriage where I'm seen as the obstacle to your dream. I won't stay where I'm constantly made to feel like I'm failing you just by existing." Reality crashed over James like ice water. Panic flooded his eyes as he realized what his words had done, what he'd just destroyed in a moment of weakness and selfishness. "Wait, Joyce. No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way." He reached for her, but she stepped back. "Yes, you did," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You've made it crystal clear, James. You want a baby. You just don't want it with me." The truth of that statement hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. James opened his mouth to protest, to take it back, to somehow undo the devastation he'd just caused. But no words came. What could he possibly say? They both knew what he'd meant, even if he hadn't had the courage to say it directly. In that moment, Watching the woman he loved look at him like he was a stranger, James realized what he'd done. But sometimes realizations come too late. Sometimes you can't unring a bell. Sometimes the words you speak in anger and frustration become the words that define everything that comes after. Joyce turned and walked to their bedroom with quiet dignity, even as her heart shattered into pieces. She emerged a short while later with a suitcase in hand, her eyes red but her jaw set with determination. She'd made her decision. She wouldn't beg someone to love her the way she deserved. She wouldn't stay in a marriage where her value was measured by her fertility. James stood in the hallway, heartbreak etched into every line of his face. "Please, don't go," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "We can figure this out. We can go to counseling, we can try different approaches, we can—" "You can't unsay what you said," Joyce interrupted, swallowing the lump in her throat. "You can't unfeel what you feel. I can't stay here and be made to feel like I'm not enough. I deserve someone who won't walk out on me when things get hard. I deserve someone who will fight for us, not against us." Her voice was heavy with sorrow, but also with a strength James had never fully appreciated until it was being used to walk away from him. Joyce headed toward the door, and James stood there, frozen, watching the best thing in his life leave, because he'd been too blind, too selfish, too focused on what he didn't have to appreciate what he did. With that, Joyce left the house, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She left behind the home they'd built together, the dreams they'd shared, the future they'd planned. James stood alone in the hallway, surrounded by the deafening silence of his own making. Both of their hearts were shattered that night. Both of them were broken by words that could never be taken back, by damage that felt irreparable, by a trust that had been so completely violated that neither of them could imagine how it could ever be restored. But here's what neither of them knew in that moment of devastation: this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning of a much longer, much more painful journey that would force both of them to confront who they really were and what they truly valued. Sometimes we have to lose everything to understand what we had. Sometimes we have to walk through fire to appreciate what we took for granted. The question is, can people really change? Or do we just become better at hiding who we've always been? The months that followed were a masterclass in survival and reinvention. Joyce moved into a small apartment in a vibrant Des Moines neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors actually talk to each other, where community gardens sprouted between buildings, where life felt more immediate and real than the suburban comfort she'd shared with James. Her close friend helped her move in, and her family, despite being hours away, in Chicago, became her lifeline through daily phone calls and weekend visits. They never said "I told you so," even though some of them had worried about the interracial marriage, about the cultural differences, about whether a white man from old Iowa money could truly understand their daughter's world. They just loved her, supported her, and reminded her that she was so much more than someone's wife, someone's potential baby maker. And Joyce? She poured every ounce of her broken heart into her work. The youth art outreach program she'd started became her salvation. She threw herself into expanding it, bringing art classes and supplies to underserved children across Des Moines. Kids who'd never held a paintbrush discovered they had talent. Teenagers who'd never imagined college found pathways through art scholarships. Joyce became a beacon in the community. Her story featured in local news segments that celebrated her dedication to giving children opportunities they might never have otherwise had. Her days were full, rewarding, exhausting in the best way. She'd arrive at the gallery before dawn and leave after sunset, surrounded by the colorful chaos of children. His creativity, their laughter drowning out the voice in her head that still whispered she wasn't enough. But in the quiet moments, when the paintbrushes were cleaned and stored, when the gallery lights were turned off, when she returned to her small apartment, Joyce's thoughts drifted back to James. She missed his laugh, the way it started deep in his chest and filled an entire room. She missed his support, the way he used to listen to her talk about her art students with genuine interest. She missed the way he made her feel safe, protected, cherished. But then she'd remember that night, those words, that look in his eyes that told her she was an obstacle to his happiness. The pain would rush back, sharp and fresh as if it had just happened. So she'd steel herself, push the memories down, and focus on what she could control: her art, her students, her independence. What Joyce didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that something had happened after she left. Something that made those lonely nights and painful memories feel even more complicated. She was pregnant. Her body was already nurturing the very thing they'd been desperately trying to create, the very thing that had torn them apart. But she wouldn't discover this for another few weeks, and when she did, the decision she'd make would alter the trajectory of everything. Meanwhile, across town, in a luxury high-rise condo with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Des Moines skyline, James was discovering that success means nothing when you're alone. His real estate empire continued to grow. He closed a major downtown development deal that made regional headlines, acquired several profitable farmland estates, and earned recognition as one of Iowa's most promising young business leaders. Magazine profiles praised his vision. Business partners sought his expertise. His bank accounts swelled with money he had no real desire to spend. But every evening, he returned to that beautiful, empty condo, and the silence there was unbearable. James tried to fill the void. His mother, concerned about his obvious misery, encouraged him to start dating again. "You're young, successful, handsome," she'd say, conveniently ignoring the pain in his eyes. "There are plenty of women who would be thrilled to be with you." So he tried. He went to dinner with a colleague's daughter, a pleasant blonde woman, who worked in finance and talked enthusiastically about market trends. He attended a charity gala with a friend's sister, a beautiful brunette who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know him. He even tried a dating app, swiping through profiles of women who looked perfect on paper. But none of them were Joyce. None of them had her warmth, her intelligence, her ability to make him laugh at himself. None of them challenged him the way she did, pushed him to be better, made him think about the world differently. Every dinner conversation felt hollow. Every attempted connection felt forced. The blonde from finance didn't understand why he cared so much about community development. The brunette from the gala had never been to a gospel service and seemed confused when he mentioned it. The women from the dating app were looking for the Millionaire CEO, not the broken man behind the title. After a few painful months, James stopped trying altogether. He deleted the apps, politely declined further setups, and accepted the loneliness as penance for what he'd done. Alone with his thoughts in that sterile condo, James was forced to confront the man he'd become. Late at night, unable to sleep, he'd replay that argument over and over in his mind. He'd hear his own voice saying those devastating words, see the look on Joyce's face when she realized he was essentially telling her she wasn't enough. The guilt was crushing. He drafted emails to Joyce dozens of times, long, rambling apologies that tried to explain what he'd been feeling, what he'd been going through, how sorry he was for letting pressure and pride destroy the best thing in his life. But he never sent them. What could he possibly say that would make a difference? How could words undo the damage other words had caused? The worst part, the part that kept James awake until dawn, was the growing realization that he'd been wrong about everything. Not just wrong about how he'd handled the situation, but fundamentally wrong about what mattered. He'd been so focused on the baby he didn't have that he'd failed to appreciate the wife he did have. He'd let his parents' expectations, his friends' milestones, his own timeline dictate his happiness. And in doing so, he'd thrown away genuine love for a fantasy. And then came the discovery that would haunt him with bitter irony. 6 months after Joyce left, James finally did something he should have done much earlier. He went to see a fertility specialist on his own. He wanted to know if there was something wrong with him, if he was the problem. The results came back, and they were devastating in their clarity. Low sperm motility, hormonal imbalances. The doctor explained, in clinical terms, that the difficulty conceiving had likely been primarily due to James's own fertility issues, not Joyce's. It was treatable, manageable, but it would have required patience and medical intervention. The very things James had been unwilling to consider when he was too busy blaming their situation on timing, on fate, on anything except the possibility that he might be the problem. James sat in his car in the medical center parking lot after that appointment and wept. He'd destroyed his marriage because he couldn't get his wife pregnant, And it turned out he was the reason they couldn't conceive. The irony was too cruel, too perfectly devastating. If he'd been more patient, more supportive, more willing to investigate all possibilities, instead of letting frustration turn into blame, they might have figured this out together. They might have gotten treatment. They might have had the family they both wanted. Instead, his pride and impatience had cost him everything. But James, to his credit, didn't let this revelation turn into self-pity. Instead, it became a catalyst for real change. He started seeing a therapist, working through not just the grief of losing Joyce, but the deeper issues of ego and control that had led him to that point. He learned to sit with discomfort instead of trying to fix everything immediately. He learned that love wasn't about getting what you want when you want it. It was about partnership, patience, and valuing the person you're with more than any outcome they might provide. He also found a quiet way to stay connected to Joyce's world, even if he couldn't be in her life. When he read a news article about a city youth art exhibit featuring work from underprivileged children, he recognized Joyce's program immediately. The article mentioned funding, challenges, the constant struggle to provide supplies and instruction to all the kids who wanted to participate. James called the gallery the next day and arranged an anonymous donation, a substantial grant that would fund the program for the next 2 years. He didn't want recognition or thanks. He just wanted to support Joyce's dream, even if he couldn't support her directly. It was the least he could do. It was all he could do. The grant administrator thanked the anonymous benefactor profusely during a phone call, mentioning how this funding would allow them to expand to 3 more schools, to provide supplies for hundreds of additional children. James listened, tears in his eyes, imagining Joyce's reaction when she heard the news. He could picture her smile, her excitement, the way she'd throw herself into expanding the program with renewed energy. And even though he couldn't see it, couldn't be part of it, knowing he'd helped made him feel closer to her than he had in months. 2 years passed this way. 2 years of separate lives, separate growth, separate healing. Joyce became stronger, more independent, more confident in her own worth. She proved to herself that she was whole on her own, that she didn't need a man's validation to be valuable. Her art program became one of the most respected youth initiatives in Iowa, earning her awards and recognition that felt meaningful precisely because she'd built it herself, on her own terms. But she was also navigating something else, something that had fundamentally changed her life in ways she never could have anticipated, something she'd kept secret from everyone except her closest friend and family. James became more introspective, more humble, more aware of his own flaws and the work required to overcome them. His business continued to thrive, but he approached it differently now, less focused on conquest and more interested in building things that mattered, developments that served communities rather than just generating profits. He funded scholarship programs at local colleges. He invested in affordable housing projects. He tried, in his own way, to become the kind of man Joyce had once believed he could be. But every success felt hollow because he couldn't share it with the person who mattered most. Neither of them dated seriously during those 2 years. Joyce had a few coffee meetings with men friends tried to set her up with, but her heart wasn't in it. She had other priorities now, other responsibilities that made casual dating feel impossible. James didn't even try. He told his mother, finally and firmly, to stop with the matchmaking attempts. "I'm not ready," he'd say, which was partly true. The whole truth was that he didn't want anyone else. He wanted the woman he'd lost, and no amount of time seemed to diminish that want. They moved through Des Moines in separate orbits, occasionally hearing news about each other through mutual acquaintances. Joyce heard that James's business was booming. James heard that Joyce's art program had received major funding and was expanding rapidly. Sometimes they'd be at the same event. Des Moines wasn't that big a city, but they'd carefully avoid each other, neither ready for an encounter that might reopen wounds that hadn't fully healed. But here's the thing about fate, about destiny, about whatever force guides our lives toward the moments that matter most. You can't avoid it forever. You can build walls, create distance, construct entirely new lives, but if 2 people are meant to find their way back to each other, the universe has a way of making it happen. Sometimes it's dramatic, Sometimes it's quiet. And sometimes it happens on a warm summer evening at an art gallery when the past and present collide in a way that neither of them saw coming. So let me ask you this. If you had the chance to face the person who broke your heart, the person whose words made you feel worthless, the person you'd spent 2 years trying to forget, would you run toward them or away? Would you give them a chance to explain, or would you protect yourself from being hurt again? Joyce was about to find out what choice she'd make, and James was about to discover if genuine change and 2 years of regret were enough to earn him even 5 minutes of her time. Because the thing about second chances is this: they only matter if both people are willing to risk everything again. They only work if the person who caused the pain has truly changed, and if the person who was hurt is willing to be vulnerable one more time. It's the highest stakes gamble there is, and neither Joyce nor James knew if they had the courage to take it. But they were about to find out. The African American Museum of Iowa was alive with energy that warm summer evening, filled with the kind of buzzing excitement that only comes when art and purpose intersect. The exhibition, celebrating youth artwork from underprivileged communities, had drawn a crowd larger than anyone expected. Politicians, philanthropists, educators, families and art lovers all gathered under the museum's high ceilings to witness what happens when you give children the tools to express themselves. Colorful paintings lined the walls, each one telling a story of hope, struggle, identity, and dreams. Papier-mâché sculptures occupied pedestals. A massive collaborative mural stretched across the back wall, created by dozens of young hands working together to depict their vision of community. The air hummed with conversation, with laughter, with the clinking of wine glasses and the soft jazz music playing in the background. And somewhere in the middle of all this beautiful chaos stood Joyce, the woman who'd made it all possible. She wore an elegant blue gown that caught the light just right, her natural hair styled in a way that was both sophisticated and authentically her. She looked confident, radiant, successful, every inch the accomplished woman she'd become over the past 2 years. But inside, Joyce's heart was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with her upcoming speech. She'd been circulating through the crowd, accepting congratulations, explaining the program's impact, thanking donors and supporters. She was in her element, doing what she loved, surrounded by proof that her work mattered. This should have been one of the happiest nights of her life. So why did she feel like something was about to shift, like the universe was holding its breath before delivering news she wasn't sure she was ready to hear? Across the gallery, near the entrance, James stood frozen. He'd arrived 20 minutes earlier, his palms sweating despite the museum's air conditioning, his heart pounding so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. He'd known Joyce's program was being featured tonight. He'd read about it in the local paper, had even recognized some of the artwork from the schools his anonymous grant had funded. He'd told himself he was coming only to support youth art education, only to see the impact of the program, only to be a quiet observer in the back of the room. But that was a lie, and he knew it. He'd come because he couldn't stay away any longer. He'd come because 2 years of regret and longing had become unbearable. He'd come because he needed to see her, even if she refused to speak to him, even if she looked at him with the same devastation he'd seen in her eyes the night she left. And then he spotted her across the crowded hall, and the world seemed to narrow until she was all he could see. Joyce stood beside that vibrant children's mural, talking to an older couple who were clearly enthralled by whatever she was saying. She gestured expressively with her hands, the way she always did when she was passionate about something, and even from this distance, James could see her eyes light up with that familiar warmth he'd missed every single day since she'd walked out of his life. She was more beautiful than he remembered, but it was more than that. She had this presence now, this self-assurance that came from someone who'd been knocked down and chosen to stand back up stronger. She'd built this without him, despite him. She'd taken her pain and turned it into purpose, and James felt simultaneously proud of her and devastated by his own role in causing that pain. For several long minutes, James just watched her, trying to work up the courage to approach. What would he even say? "I'm sorry," felt inadequate. "I was wrong," was obvious. "I've missed you" was selfish when she'd clearly moved on and thrived without him. Maybe he should just leave, he thought. Maybe showing up here was already too much, too presumptuous, too. And then Joyce turned, perhaps feeling the weight of someone's gaze, and their eyes met across the crowded gallery hall. Time did that thing it does in movies, where everything slows down and the background noise fades, and you're hyper-aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every micro-expression on the other person's face. Joyce's eyes widened in shock. Her hand, which had been gesturing toward the mural, froze mid-air. The smile she'd been wearing faltered, replaced by something more complex: surprise. Yes, but also confusion, pain, and something else James couldn't quite read. Was it anger? Fear? Or could it possibly be something softer, something that suggested she'd thought about him too during these 2 years apart? The older couple Joyce had been talking to noticed her sudden distraction and followed her gaze. They said something to her, probably asking if she was all right, but Joyce barely seemed to hear them. She was staring at James, and he was staring back, and neither of them seemed capable of looking away or moving or doing anything, except acknowledging that this moment, this collision of past and present, was happening whether they were ready for it or not. James made the decision for both of them. He started walking toward her, weaving through clusters of people, his expensive shoes clicking on the polished floor, his breath coming shorter with each step. Joyce watched him approach, and he saw her visibly straighten her spine. Saw her lift her chin in that way she did when she was preparing to be strong. She said something to the older couple, a polite excuse that sent them wandering toward the refreshment table, and then she was alone beside the mural, waiting, as James closed the final distance between them. "Joyce," he said softly when he reached her, her name on his lips feeling like coming home and like trespassing all at once. "James," she replied, her voice carefully neutral, trying to maintain her composure even though her heart was hammering. I didn't expect to see you here. I heard about the exhibit," James admitted, shoving his hands in his pockets to keep them from trembling. "I thought it might be your work, and I had to come see it. I hope that's okay. I can leave if—" "No," Joyce interrupted, perhaps too quickly. She paused, collected herself. "No, you don't have to leave. This is a public event." An awkward silence settled between them, heavy with 2 years of unspoken words, unresolved pain, and the ghost of what they'd once been to each other. Around them, the gala continued. People laughing, discussing art, living their lives completely, unaware that 2 broken hearts were attempting their first tentative steps toward, what? Reconciliation? Closure? Neither of them knew. James gestured around at the artwork covering the walls, desperate to fill the silence with something other than apologies he wasn't sure she wanted to hear. "This is amazing, Joyce. What you've built here, what you've done for these kids, it's incredible. You should be so proud." Joyce's expression softened slightly, her love for her work temporarily, overriding the complicated emotions of seeing her ex-husband. "Thank you," she said, and he could hear the genuine pleasure in her voice. "It's been the most fulfilling work of my life. These kids, they have so much talent and potential. They just needed someone to believe in them and give them the resources to express themselves. That's what you've always done best," James said quietly, "seeing potential in people, helping them become who they're meant to be." The compliment hung in the air between them, and Joyce felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack. This was the James she'd fallen in love with, the one who noticed things, who understood her on a deeper level, who made her feel seen. But it was also the James who'd broken her heart, and she couldn't let herself forget that just because he was saying kind things now. Before she could respond, an announcement echoed through the gallery hall. The speeches were about to begin, and Joyce was being called to the small stage that had been set up near the front. She looked at James, conflicted, and he saw the struggle in her eyes. "Go," he encouraged gently. "I'll wait. If you want to talk afterward, I'll be here." Joyce studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Sincerity, perhaps, or evidence that This wasn't just a momentary impulse that would disappear as quickly as his patience had 2 years ago. Whatever she found, there must have been enough, because she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said softly. "Wait for me." Then she turned and walked toward the stage, her blue gown swishing around her legs, leaving James standing alone beside. The children's mural with his heart in his throat and hope flickering in his chest for the first time in 2 years. Joyce's speech was everything James expected it to be. Passionate, articulate, moving. She talked about the transformative power of art, about giving children from underprivileged backgrounds the same opportunities that wealthier kids took for granted, about seeing the world through young eyes and being reminded that hope and creativity can flourish even in the hardest circumstances. She thanked her team, the schools that had participated, the donors who'd made it possible, including one anonymous benefactor, whose extraordinarily generous grant had allowed them to expand beyond anything they'd dreamed possible. James felt his throat tighten at that mention. She didn't know. She had no idea that he was the anonymous donor, that he'd been supporting her work from afar, that he'd found this small way to stay connected to her mission even when he couldn't be in her life. Should he tell her? Would she see it as a genuine gesture of support, or as an attempt to buy his way back into her good graces? As Joyce spoke, James couldn't take his eyes off her. He watched the way she commanded the room, the way people leaned forward to hear every word, the way her passion made everyone care about something they might not have considered before. She'd always been captivating, but there was something different now, a strength and self-possession. That came from someone who'd survived heartbreak and emerged not just intact but enhanced. She'd become even more than the woman he'd fallen in love with, and he'd missed all of it. He'd given up the privilege of witnessing her growth, of supporting her through challenges, of celebrating her victories. That realization hurt almost as much as knowing he'd been the one to cause their separation in the first place. The speech ended to enthusiastic applause. People surged forward to congratulate Joyce, to ask questions about the program, to express interest in supporting future initiatives. James hung back, watching from a distance, wondering if she'd forgotten about him in the excitement, wondering if he should just slip out quietly and let her enjoy her triumph without the complication of his presence. But then, through the crowd, Joyce's eyes found his. She was surrounded by admirers, trapped in a conversation with what looked like a city council member, but she was looking at James, and in that look he saw an invitation. "Wait," her eyes seemed to say, "I haven't forgotten. We still need to talk." So James waited, nursing a glass of wine he barely touched, making small talk with other guests while keeping Joyce in his peripheral vision. The reception seemed to stretch on forever, speeches by other organizers, a performance by some of the young artists, more mingling and networking. But eventually, gradually, the crowd began to thin. Some guests left for other evening commitments. Others clustered in small groups, deep in conversation. And finally, blessedly, Joyce extricated herself from her admirers and made her way through the gallery toward where James stood, waiting in a quieter corner near a series of paintings that depicted neighborhood scenes from the artists' communities. "Sorry that took so long," Joyce said as she approached, a slight breathlessness to her voice that might have been from rushing over or might have been from nervousness. Everyone wanted to talk about expanding the program to their school or neighborhood. "Don't apologize," James said quickly. "This is your night. You should enjoy every minute of it." "It is my night," Joyce agreed, something unreadable in her expression. "But apparently, it's also the night I run into my ex-husband after 2 years of silence." The word ex-husband hit James like a physical blow, even though it was technically accurate. They'd never officially divorced. The separation had been sudden, and neither of them had taken legal steps to formalize the end of their marriage. But hearing Joyce refer to him that way, as someone who existed in her past rather than her present, drove home just how much ground he'd have to make up if there was any chance of what? He didn't even know what he was hoping for. Forgiveness, understanding, another chance. "There's a balcony," Joyce said, gesturing toward a side door. "It's quieter out there. We could talk." James nodded, not trusting his voice, and followed her through the gallery, and out onto a secluded balcony that overlooked the Des Moines River. The summer evening air was warm and gentle, carrying the scent of the water and the distant sounds of the city. String lights had been hung along the balcony's edge, creating a soft glow that felt almost romantic, though James tried not to read too much into the setting. This wasn't a date. This was two people who'd once loved each other, trying to figure out if they could even be in the same space without causing each other more pain. They stood at the railing for a moment in silence, both of them staring out at the water, gathering courage for a conversation. Neither of them knew how to start. Finally, Joyce turned to face him, and the directness of her gaze made James's heart skip. "Why are you here, James?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "And please don't tell me it was just to see the art exhibit." James took a deep breath. This was it. The moment he'd been both longing for and dreading for 2 years. The chance to finally say everything he'd been rehearsing in his head, everything he'd written in unsent emails, everything he'd whispered to the empty walls of his condo late at night when the loneliness became unbearable. "You're right," he admitted, turning to face her fully. "I came because I hoped I might see you. I needed to see you, Joyce. I've needed to see you every day for the past 2 years." Joyce's expression remained carefully neutral, but he saw her hands tighten on the railing. "That's a choice you made," she said quietly. "You could have reached out any time. You could have called or emailed or shown up at my apartment. You didn't." "I know," James said, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't because I was ashamed, because I didn't think I deserved your time, because I was trying to become someone worthy of asking for forgiveness before I came to you with empty apologies." He paused, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Joyce, I need to say this, even if you never want to see me again after tonight. I need you to know how sorry I am for everything." Joyce's eyes began to glisten with unshed tears, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I'm sorry for the things I said that night," James went on, his voice trembling now. "I'm sorry for making you feel like you weren't enough when the truth is you were everything. I'm sorry for letting the pressure of wanting a child override my appreciation for the incredible woman I already had. I'm sorry for being so blind, so selfish, so focused on what I thought I needed, that I destroyed what I actually needed most. You." A tear slipped down Joyce's cheek, and she brushed it away quickly, as if angry at herself for showing emotion. "You broke my heart, James," she whispered. "I gave you everything I had, and you made me feel like I was failing you just by existing. Do you have any idea what that did to me? How long it took me to believe I had value outside of my ability to give you a child?" "I know," James said, his own eyes filling with tears. "And I will regret causing you that pain for the rest of my life. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I pushed you away because I was scared and immature, and too proud to admit that maybe the problem wasn't you or timing or fate. Maybe it was me." Joyce's eyes widened slightly at that last part. "What do you mean?" James took another deep breath. This was the hardest part, the confession that made him feel both vindicated and devastated. "After you left, I finally did what I should have done from the beginning. I went to see a fertility specialist, alone. I wanted to know if there was something wrong with me." He paused, struggling with the words. "It turns out there was. Low sperm motility, hormonal imbalances. The doctor told me that the difficulty we had conceiving was likely primarily due to my issues, not yours." Joyce gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. A complex mixture of emotions crossed her face. Shock, vindication, anger, sadness, all swirling together. "All those months of you implying it was my fault," she said, her voice shaking. "All that pressure you put on me, all those disappointed looks when I couldn't get pregnant. And it was you all along?" "I know," James said miserably. "The irony isn't lost on me. If I'd been more patient, more willing to look at all possibilities instead of assuming time was the only factor, we might have figured it out together. We might have gotten treatment. We might have had the family we wanted." His voice broke. "Instead, my pride and impatience cost me everything." They stood there in the soft glow of the string lights, 2 years of separation suddenly feeling both vast and insignificant. Joyce struggled to process this information, to reconcile the man who'd hurt her so deeply, with the man standing before her now, clearly transformed by regret and self-awareness. "Why are you telling me this?" Joyce asked finally. "Why now, after all this time?" James looked directly into her eyes, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Because I've changed, Joyce. I'm not the same man who let you walk out that door. I've spent 2 years in therapy, working on myself, figuring out why I acted the way I did. I've learned to sit with discomfort, instead of trying to control everything. I've learned that love isn't about getting what you want when you want it. It's about partnership, and patience and valuing your partner more than any outcome they might provide." He stepped closer, and Joyce didn't move away. "I can't undo what I did," James continued, his voice raw with emotion. "I can't give you back those 2 years. I can't erase the pain I caused, but I can promise you that I've learned from it. I will never make that mistake again. I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving that I can be the man you deserve, if you'll let me." He paused, gathering courage for the most vulnerable question of all. "Is there any chance at all, that you might consider giving me another opportunity to be in your life?" The question hung in the warm summer air between them. Joyce looked at James, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't seen that terrible night 2 years ago. She saw genuine remorse, deep self-awareness, and the kind of humility that only comes from someone who's been broken and chose to rebuild themselves better. This wasn't the proud, impatient man who'd blamed their fertility struggles on everything except himself. This was someone who'd done the hard work of change. But Joyce had also changed. She wasn't the same woman who'd left his house in tears, feeling worthless and broken. She'd built a life she was proud of, proven her value to herself and her community, learned that she could stand on her own. And she'd been carrying a secret for 2 years, a truth that would change everything James thought he knew about their story. Joyce took a deep breath, her heart pounding so hard she was sure James could hear it. This was the moment. She could walk away right now, protect herself from the risk of being hurt again, maintain the safe life she'd constructed. Or she could be brave one more time, vulnerable one more time, and tell him the truth that had been shaping her world for the past 2 years. "James," she said softly, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you, too." James's eyes widened with concern at her tone. "What is it?" Joyce felt tears begin to stream down her face as she prepared to change both of their lives forever. "After I left that night, after our fight, I found out I was pregnant." The words seemed to echo in the space between them. James froze, his face going completely still except for his eyes, which widened in shock and disbelief. "Pregnant?" he breathed, the word barely audible. Joyce nodded, tears flowing freely now. "I had our baby, James, a little girl." She paused, letting the magnitude of that statement sink in. "Her name is Amara, and she's 18 months old." If the balcony had suddenly collapsed beneath him, James couldn't have been more shocked. His legs felt weak, his vision blurred. His mind raced to comprehend what Joyce had just told him. A daughter. They had a daughter. He was a father. He'd been a father for 18 months and hadn't known it. We have a daughter," he whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it real, would transform this revelation from impossible dream to undeniable truth. "Yes," Joyce confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. 1,000 questions flooded James's mind at once, but the first one that escaped his lips was filled with anguish. "Why didn't you tell me?" Joyce flinched at the pain in his voice, but she didn't look away. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "I found out I was pregnant about 6 weeks after I left. I was terrified and alone, and still processing everything that had happened between us. And all I could hear were your words from that night, that you didn't know if having a baby with me was ever going to happen, that maybe love wasn't enough. So I convinced myself that you wouldn't want her, that you'd reject us both, that I was better off raising her on my own than subjecting both of us to your disappointment." James felt like his heart was being torn in two. Part of him wanted to be angry angry that she'd kept his child from him, angry that he'd missed the pregnancy, the birth, the first 18 months of his daughter's life. But how could he be angry when he'd given Joyce every reason to believe he wouldn't want their child? When his own words and actions had created the fear that led to her decision? "Joyce," he said, his voice breaking, tears streaming down his face. "Now, I know I gave you every reason to think I wouldn't want her, every reason to believe I was too selfish and impatient to be a good father, but you were wrong." He took her hands in his, holding them gently. "I would have wanted her. I would have wanted her so much. Not just because she's the baby I thought I wanted so desperately, but because she's part of you. Because anything that came from you would be precious to me." Fresh tears spilled from Joyce's eyes at his words. These were the words she'd longed to hear during those lonely months of pregnancy, during the terrifying hours of labor when she'd had only her mother and best friend by her side, during the countless sleepless nights of new motherhood when she'd rocked their baby, alone, and wondered if she'd made the right choice in keeping Amara's existence a secret. "I wish I could have been there," James continued, his voice shaking with emotion. "I wish I could have supported you through the pregnancy, held your hand during the birth, been there for every milestone I've missed. But I understand why you didn't tell me. I understand that I destroyed your trust so completely that you couldn't believe I'd step up. That's on me. That's my fault." They stood there on the balcony, both crying now, grieving the lost time, while simultaneously processing this seismic shift in their reality. Around them, the sounds of the city continued, cars passing, distant music, the river flowing, completely indifferent to the fact that two lives were being fundamentally altered in this moment. "Can the first—" James started, then had to stop and gather himself. "Can I meet her? Our daughter? Amara?" Even saying her name felt sacred, like he was invoking something precious and holy that he hadn't earned the right to claim. Joyce searched his face, looking for any sign of the man who'd hurt her, any hint of the impatience and selfishness that had driven them apart. But all she saw was genuine longing, profound regret, and something that looked like desperate hope. She thought about Amara at home with her mother, who'd come to help with childcare during the gala. She thought about her daughter's big brown eyes, her infectious giggle, the way she'd just started saying Mama with increasing clarity. She thought about how Amara deserved to know her father, assuming that father had truly changed and wouldn't disappoint her the way he'd disappointed Joyce. But what if James was just caught up in the emotion of the moment? What if his desire to be involved faded when he realized how hard parenting actually was? How much sacrifice it required? How little control you actually had over outcomes? Could Joyce risk letting him into Amara's life only to have him disappear when reality didn't match his fantasy? "I need you to understand something," Joyce said firmly, her tears subsiding as she shifted into protective mother mode. "If you meet her, if you become part of her life, you can't just leave when it gets hard or when it's not what you expected. Amara is a real person, not an idea or a wish or something to complete your life. She's demanding and exhausting and wonderful and perfect, and she deserves a father who will be there consistently, not just when it's convenient." "I understand," James said earnestly. "I'm not asking to step into her life as if the past 2 years didn't happen. I'm not asking for instant fatherhood or for you to trust me immediately. I'm just asking for a chance to meet her, to get to know her, to prove that I can be the father she deserves." His voice cracked with emotion. "Please, Joyce, please let me meet our daughter." Joyce looked at James for a long moment, weighing her fear against her daughter's right to know. Her father, weighing her own hurt against the genuine change she saw in the man before her. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Yes," she said softly, "you can meet her. But we'll take it slow. We'll see how she responds to you, how you handle the reality of parenthood, how committed you are when the novelty wears off. This isn't about us, James. This is about what's best for Amara." Relief and gratitude flooded James's face so completely that he looked 10 years younger. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I won't let her down. I won't let either of you down." Unable to hold back any longer, James pulled Joyce into his arms. She stiffened for just a moment, old hurt creating reflexive resistance, but then she melted into the embrace. They held each other tightly under the twinkling string lights, both crying. Softly, crying for the time they'd lost, for the pain they'd caused each other, for the daughter they'd created together but parented apart, and for the fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, broken things could be mended. When they finally pulled apart, Joyce wiped her eyes and let out a shaky laugh. "I can't believe this is happening," she said. "I've played out this conversation in my head 1,000 times, but I never imagined it would actually occur. When can I meet her?" James asked, unable to hide the eagerness in his voice. "Tomorrow? This weekend? Whenever you think is right, I'll be there." Joyce smiled despite herself at his enthusiasm, so different from the controlled, impatient man he'd been before. "Tomorrow," she decided. "Come to my apartment tomorrow afternoon. 3 o'clock. That's usually a good time for her. She'll be fed and rested and in a decent mood." "Tomorrow at 3, James repeated, committing it to memory like the most important appointment of his life. Because it was. "I'll be there." They exchanged phone numbers, a surreal experience given that they'd once been married, and now had to save each other's contact information like new acquaintances. James wanted to ask a million questions about Amara, what she liked, what she looked like, whether she had his eyes or Joyce's smile, what her personality was like. But he held back, sensing that Joyce had given him enough for one night, that pushing for more might damage the fragile trust they were beginning to rebuild. "I should get back inside," Joyce said, glancing toward the gallery door. "People will be wondering where I disappeared to." "Of course," James agreed. "Go. Enjoy your success. You've earned it." Joyce started toward the door, then paused and turned back. "James, yes, I meant what I said. If you meet her, you have to be all in. I won't let you hurt her the way you hurt me." The weight of that statement settled over James like a mantle, a responsibility he was determined to bear. "I understand," he said solemnly, "and I promise you, I've learned from my mistakes. I won't repeat them." Joyce nodded, then disappeared back into the gallery, leaving James alone on the balcony with his thoughts and the overwhelming reality that tomorrow he would meet his daughter for the first time. He stood there for a long time after she left, gripping the railing, looking out at the river, trying to process the emotional whiplash of the evening. 2 hours ago, he'd walked into this museum hoping for nothing more than a glimpse of Joyce from across a crowded room. Now, he was going to be a father. Now he had a chance, not a guarantee, but a chance, to be part of his daughter's life. Now the future that had seemed so bleak and empty suddenly held possibilities he'd thought were lost forever. But James knew better than to get too far ahead of himself. Joyce had been clear, this was a trial, not a reconciliation. He would have to earn his way back into their lives, prove that his change was real and lasting, demonstrate through consistent action that he was worthy of their trust. And even if he succeeded, even if he became the father Amara deserved, that didn't necessarily mean Joyce would want him back as a partner. He might have to accept being permanently in the friend zone, connected to Joyce only through their shared love for their daughter. That would be painful, he knew. Being close to Joyce but not with her, seeing her regularly but not being able to hold her, watching her potentially date other men while he remained on the sidelines. But if that was the price of knowing his daughter, of being part of her life, then he would pay it gladly. His wants didn't matter anymore. What mattered was Amara and proving to Joyce that he'd become someone dependable and steady. James finally left the balcony and made his way through the gallery, which was mostly empty now, except for a few lingering guests and museum staff beginning to clean up. He spotted Joyce across the room, deep in conversation with what looked like a reporter based on the notepad in the woman's hand. Their eyes met briefly, and Joyce gave him a small smile, tentative but genuine. James smiled back, then slipped out of the museum into the warm summer night, his heart fuller than it had been in 2 years despite the emotional exhaustion settling into his bones. That night, James couldn't sleep. He lay in his expensive king-sized bed in his luxury condo, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of tomorrow. What should he wear? Something casual, probably. He didn't want to seem like he was trying too hard. Should he bring a gift? Yes, definitely. But what? He didn't know anything about 18-month-old girls. He'd have to go shopping first thing in the morning, find something appropriate. What if Amara didn't like him? What if she cried when she saw him? What if he said or did something wrong, and Joyce decided this whole thing was a mistake? Around 2 in the morning, James gave up on sleep and grabbed his laptop. He spent the next several hours reading everything he could find about toddler development, about building relationships with young children, about being a good father. He watched YouTube videos of dads interacting with their toddler daughters, took notes on gentle parenting techniques, researched age-appropriate toys and activities. By the time the sun rose, James had created a detailed document of everything he'd learned, filled with tips on communication, play, and connection with a child Amara's age. As ridiculous as it might seem, the research made him feel more prepared, more confident that he could do this. Because the truth was, James was terrified. Not of meeting Amara, he couldn't wait for that, but of failing her, of proving Joyce's fears correct, of disappointing his daughter before he'd even had a chance to be her father. The stakes felt impossibly high because they were. This wasn't a business deal he could charm his way through, or a property he could acquire with the right offer. This was a child who deserved his absolute best, and anything less than that would be unacceptable. At 9 in the morning, James was showered, dressed, and walking into a children's toy store in downtown Des Moines. A friendly saleswoman in her 60s approached him with a knowing smile. "Shopping for your daughter?" she asked. "Yes," James said, the word still feeling surreal on his tongue. "She's 18 months old, and I'm meeting her for the first time today." If the saleswoman found that statement odd, she didn't show it. Instead, her expression softened with understanding. "That's wonderful," she said warmly. "Let me show you some things that are perfect for that age." She guided him through the store, explaining the benefits of various toys, soft plush animals that were comforting, building blocks that developed motor skills, board books with bright pictures and simple stories. James listened intently, asking questions, wanting to make the perfect choice. Finally, he settled on a soft stuffed bunny with floppy ears and gentle eyes, a set of colorful stacking cups, and a board book about families. The saleswoman wrapped them beautifully, and as James paid, she squeezed his hand. "You're going to do great," she assured him. "The fact that you're here, putting in this effort, that's what matters." James hoped she was right. The hours between leaving the toy store and 3 o'clock felt like an eternity. James tried to work, reviewing documents for a development project, but he couldn't concentrate. He tried to eat lunch, but his stomach was too knotted with nervous anticipation. He changed his shirt 3 times, worried about looking too formal, then too casual, then finally settling on something. In between, nice jeans and a soft button-down that seemed appropriate for meeting your daughter for the first time. At 2:45, James stood outside Joyce's apartment building, the wrapped gifts. In his arms, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. The building was in one of Des Moines' revitalized neighborhoods, an older structure that had been converted into modern apartments while maintaining its historical character. It was nothing like the luxury condo James lived in, but it had personality, warmth, a sense of community. He could see children's bicycles in the hallway through the glass front door, colorful wreaths on various apartment doors, a community bulletin board covered with notices for playgroups and neighborhood events. This was where Joyce had built her life without him. This was where she'd raised their daughter. At precisely 3 o'clock, James pressed the buzzer for Joyce's apartment. "Come on up," her voice crackled through the intercom. "3rd floor, apartment 3B. James climbed the stairs slowly, trying to calm his breathing, trying to prepare himself for what was about to happen. When he reached the 3rd floor, Joyce was standing in her open doorway, dressed casually in jeans and a comfortable sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked nervous too, which somehow made James feel slightly better. At least he wasn't alone in his anxiety. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi," James replied, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "I brought some things for Amara. I hope that's okay." "Of course," Joyce said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Come in." James stepped into Joyce's apartment, and immediately he was struck by how much it felt like her. The walls were painted in warm, welcoming colors. Artwork, some professional, some clearly created by children, covered every available surface. There was a small kitchen with an eating area, a cozy living room with comfortable furniture arranged to encourage conversation rather than just TV, watching, and toys everywhere. Stacked neatly but unmistakably present evidence of the small person who lived here and filled this space with her presence. And then James saw her. A tiny girl with big brown eyes and soft curls peeked out from behind Joyce's legs. One small hand clutching her mother's jeans, her thumb from the other hand in her mouth. She wore a little yellow dress with flowers on it and tiny white shoes, and she was staring at James with the wary curiosity that toddlers have towards strangers. James felt his breath catch in his throat. She was real. His daughter was real. Not an idea, not a wish, not a fantasy. A real child with Joyce's eyes and his nose, with her own personality already evident in the way she assessed him carefully before making any move. She was beautiful. She was perfect. And she was his. "Amara," Joyce said gently, crouching down to her daughter's level. "This is James. He's your daddy. He came to meet you." Amara continued to stare at James, her thumb still in her mouth clearly, trying to decide whether this tall stranger was friend or foe. James knelt down slowly, making himself less intimidating, and held out the wrapped bunny. "Hello, Amara," he said gently, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to control. "I'm so happy to meet you. I brought you something." The toddler's eyes shifted from James's face to the wrapped package, her natural curiosity beginning to overcome her wariness. She looked up at Joyce, seeking permission or reassurance, and Joyce nodded encouragingly. "It's okay, sweetheart. You can go see what it is." Slowly, tentatively, Amara released her grip on Joyce's jeans and took a few wobbly steps forward. She reached for the package with small, uncertain hands, and James gently placed it in her grasp. She tore at the paper with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of a toddler, and when the soft bunny emerged, her face lit up with a smile that absolutely destroyed James. "Bunny!" Amara exclaimed, pulling the toy to her chest and hugging it. "She loves bunnies," Joyce explained softly, watching the interaction with a mixture of emotions James couldn't quite read. "There's a rabbit that sometimes comes into the community garden behind the building, and she gets so excited every time she sees it." James felt a tear roll down his cheek, and he didn't bother to wipe it away. "She's so beautiful, Joyce," he whispered. "She's absolutely perfect." Amara, still clutching her new bunny, moved a bit closer to James, her wariness fading now that he'd proven himself a gift-giver. She reached out one small hand and patted his knee, the way children do when they're testing boundaries and connections. "Hi," she said, her voice small and sweet. "Hi, Amara," James replied, his voice breaking. "I'm your daddy." For the next hour, James sat on Joyce's living room floor and played with his daughter for the first time. Amara showed him her other toys, a collection of stuffed animals that apparently all had names, though she couldn't quite pronounce most of them. She brought him board books to read, pointing at pictures and saying the words she knew: dog, ball, baby. She stacked blocks for him to knock down, giggling with delight each time they tumbled. She brought him into her world with the unself-conscious generosity that small children have, and James soaked up every moment, memorizing every detail. Joyce watched from the couch, her heart doing complicated gymnastics in her chest. On one hand, seeing James with Amara was everything she'd secretly hoped for but been too afraid to believe in. He was gentle, patient, completely present in a way he'd never quite managed to be during their marriage, when he was always thinking about the next deal or the next goal. He wasn't performing for Joyce's benefit. She could tell the difference. He was genuinely enchanted by their daughter, genuinely interested in everything she showed him, genuinely moved by this connection he'd been deprived of for 18 months. On the other hand, watching this also hurt. It reminded Joyce of everything they'd lost, everything that could have been if James had been more patient. If she'd been braver about telling him about the pregnancy, if they'd both made different choices. It reminded her that Amara should have had her father from the beginning, should have known his voice before she was born, should have been rocked to sleep by him on difficult nights, should have had both parents present for her first smile, her first word, her first steps. But dwelling on the past wouldn't change it. All they could do was move forward, and Joyce had to admit that so far, James was exceeding her tentative expectations. After about an hour of playing, Amara began to show signs of tiredness, rubbing her eyes, becoming slightly fussy. Joyce recognized the signs immediately. "Someone's ready for her nap," she said, standing up from the couch. "Nap?" James said, unable to hide his disappointment that his time with Amara was ending. "Toddlers need their rest," Joyce explained. "She'll be up in an hour or two, and she'll be in a much better mood after she sleeps." "Of course," James said, standing as well. He looked at Amara, who was now clinging to her mother's leg again, the new bunny still clutched in her arms. "Thank you for playing with me, Amara. I had so much fun." Amara gave him a sleepy smile, then buried her face in Joyce's leg. "Can I come back?" James asked quietly. "Tomorrow, maybe? Or whenever you think is appropriate?" Joyce considered this. Part of her wanted to slow things down, maintain control, protect both herself and Amara from moving too quickly. But she could see how good this had been for everyone involved. Amara had taken to James better than Joyce had dared hope, and James had been everything she'd asked for: patient, gentle, focused entirely on his daughter rather than his own agenda. "How about the day after tomorrow?" Joyce suggested. "Same time. We could go to the park if the weather's nice. Amara loves the swings." James's face lit up like she'd just given him the greatest gift imaginable. "That would be perfect." "Thank you, Joyce. Thank you for this." Joyce nodded, then took Amara back to her bedroom for her nap. When she returned a few minutes later, James was still standing in the living room, looking at the photos on Joyce's walls, many of them featuring Amara at various ages and stages, chronicling the life he'd missed. "She's incredible," James said softly, not turning around. "You've done an amazing job with her, Joyce. She's happy and curious and sweet. That's all you. She's also strong-willed and stubborn and has a temper when things don't go her way," Joyce added with a slight smile. "Just so you know, it's not all adorable bunny hugs." James finally turned to face her. "I want to know all of it," he said seriously. "The easy parts and the hard parts. I want to be a real father, not just the fun guy who shows up occasionally with gifts." Joyce studied him for a long moment. "We'll see," she said finally, neither encouraging nor discouraging. "Just honest. Actions speak louder than words, James. Show me." "I will," James promised. "I'll show you both." As James left Joyce's apartment and made his way back down the stairs, he felt like a different person than the man who'd climbed up them just an hour earlier. He was a father now, not just biologically, but emotionally. He'd held his daughter's hand, read her stories, made her laugh. And that was just the beginning. Over the next several weeks, James became a consistent presence in Amara's life. He showed up exactly when he said he would, never cancelling, never making excuses, never letting other obligations take priority. He came to the park and pushed Amara on the swings until his arms ached. He attended a toddler music class with her and Joyce, sitting cross-legged on the floor singing the Wheels on the Bus with unself-conscious enthusiasm while the other parents smiled at his obvious joy. He learned to change diapers, mix the right consistency of toddler food, understand the subtle differences between Amara's various cries and what each one meant. He also learned that parenting was harder than he'd ever imagined. He learned that toddlers test boundaries constantly, that patience is required in quantities he'd never had to access before, that you can't control a small human no matter how much you might want to. When Amara had a meltdown in the grocery store because Joyce wouldn't buy her the sugary cereal she wanted, James learned what it felt like to have a screaming child in public while strangers judged your parenting. When Amara came down with a stomach bug and vomited all over him at 2 in the morning, James learned that love means cleaning up bodily fluids without complaint. And through it all, James never wavered. Because this was what he'd said he wanted so desperately 2 years ago, to be a father. And now that he actually was one, he discovered that the reality was simultaneously harder and more rewarding than any fantasy he'd constructed. He fell in love with his daughter more deeply every day, but it was a different kind of love than he'd expected. It wasn't about completing himself or fulfilling a goal. It was about putting someone else's needs consistently before his own, finding joy in her joy, feeling her pain as if it were his own. Joyce watched all of this with cautious optimism. She saw James showing up for the hard parts, not just the fun parts. She saw him defer to her expertise while also developing his own parenting style. She saw him prioritize Amara over his business commitments, actually leaving important meetings to make it to a toddler birthday party or a pediatrician appointment. This was the change she'd needed to see, not just words of apology, but sustained action over time. And as she watched James with their daughter, Joyce felt something shifting inside her. The wall she'd built around her heart, brick by painful brick after their separation, was beginning to develop cracks. She found herself noticing little things about him again, the way he concentrated, when reading Amara a story, doing different voices for each character, the way he'd learned to French braid Amara's hair after watching YouTube tutorials, because their daughter had seen another girl with braids and wanted them too, the way he looked at both of them sometimes, with such tender longing that it made Joyce's heart ache. One evening, about 2 months after James had re-entered their lives, they sat on a bench at the park while Amara played in a sandbox nearby. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, just watched their daughter dig in the sand with intense toddler focus. "Can I ask you something?" James said finally. "Of course," Joyce replied. "That anonymous grant that funded your art program expansion, when did that come through?" Joyce turned to look at him, confused by the seemingly random question. "About 1.5 years ago." "Why?" James took a deep breath. "Because I'm the anonymous donor." Joyce's eyes widened in shock. "You? But how did you even know about the program?" "I read about it in a local news article," James explained. "I recognized your work immediately, and when I read about the funding challenges, I wanted to help. I couldn't be part of your life, but I could support your mission. It was the only way I knew to stay connected to what you cared about." Joyce sat in stunned silence, processing this revelation. "That grant changed everything," she said quietly. "It allowed us to reach so many more children, to expand to schools we couldn't have accessed otherwise." "James, that was incredibly generous." "It was selfish, actually," James corrected gently. "It made me feel close to you when I couldn't be. It was the least I could do after everything I'd taken from you." Joyce felt tears prick her eyes. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I don't want any more secrets between us," James said simply. "Because if there's any chance of us rebuilding trust, it has to be based on complete honesty." They sat there as the sunset deepened, Amara's happy babbling in the sandbox providing a soundtrack to the moment. Joyce realized that something had shifted, that she was looking at James not as the man who'd broken her heart, but as the man who'd done the work to become someone different, someone better. "I want to tell you something too," Joyce said slowly. "When I was pregnant, when I was making the decision not to tell you, part of me hoped I was wrong. Part of me hoped that if you knew, you'd prove me wrong and be there for us. But I was too hurt and too scared to risk it." "I understand," James said softly. "And I'm sorry I gave you reason to be scared. But now," Joyce continued, "watching you with Amara these past months, seeing how you've shown up consistently even when it's hard, you're proving me wrong in the best way possible." James turned to look at her, hope flickering in his eyes. "Does that mean—" "It means I'm starting to trust you again," Joyce said carefully. "It means I can see that you've genuinely changed. It doesn't mean we rush into anything, and it doesn't mean I've forgotten the past, but it means I'm open to seeing where this goes." The hope in James's eyes bloomed into something brighter. "That's all I can ask for," he said. "I know I have to earn my way back into your heart, just like I've been earning my way into Amara's life. I'm patient now, Joyce. I've learned how to wait for things that matter. As if on cue, Amara looked up from her sandbox and called out, "Mama, Daddy, look!" She held up a plastic bucket triumphantly, filled with sand she'd painstakingly collected. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Joyce called back. James's breath caught at hearing Amara call him Daddy, something she'd only started doing in the past few weeks as their bond deepened. Every time she said it, his heart felt too big for his chest. They watched their daughter play until the park lights came on, signaling that it was time to head home. As they walked to their cars, they'd driven separately, maintaining that boundary. Amara walked between them, holding both their hands. Every few steps, she'd lift her feet and swing, letting her parents' arms support her weight, giggling with delight. It was such a simple, ordinary moment, the kind that happens in parks all over the world every evening. But for James and Joyce, it felt miraculous. It felt like a glimpse of what they could be, not what they had been. But something new, built on harder lessons and deeper foundations. A few weeks later, James received an unexpected phone call from his mother. "Your father and I would like to meet Amara," she said, her voice careful. "If you and Joyce are comfortable with that." James's relationship with his parents had been strained since the separation. They'd been disappointed by the divorce of their son's interracial marriage, worried about appearances, concerned about family reputation, but they'd also seen James's transformation over the past 2 years. And when Dee finally told them about Amara a month earlier, their reaction had surprised him. Instead of judgment or concern, they'd expressed genuine regret for not being more supportive of his marriage to Joyce and genuine excitement about having a grandchild. James discussed the request with Joyce, and after some consideration, she agreed. So, on a warm September afternoon, they drove out to the family farmhouse where James had grown up, where he'd once brought Joyce as his girlfriend and faced subtle disapproval from some relatives. But this time was different. James's parents came out to meet them as soon as they arrived, and his mother's eyes filled with tears the moment she saw Amara. "Oh, she's precious," she breathed, kneeling down to Amara's level. "Hello, sweetheart. I'm your grandmother." Amara, who'd become more confident around new people thanks to all the socializing with James, studied this new person with interest. "Gamma," she attempted, and James's mother laughed with delight. "Yes, Gamma, that's perfect." James's father, typically more reserved, was visibly moved as well. He shook Joyce's hand warmly, his eyes apologetic. "Joyce, it's good to see you again. I want you to know how sorry I am for not being more welcoming when you and James were together. We were wrong." Joyce, surprised by this direct acknowledgement, nodded graciously. "Thank you for saying that." What followed was a beautiful afternoon. James's parents were completely enchanted with Amara, and the feeling seemed to be mutual. His mother had prepared lunch, including, Joyce noticed with pleased surprise, some soul food, dishes she'd learned to make after James had mentioned they were Joyce's favorites years ago. It was a small gesture, but significant. As the afternoon wore on, James's father pulled him aside. "Son, I owe you an apology too. Your mother and I put a lot of pressure on you about having children, about carrying on the family name, all that nonsense. We see now that our expectations may have contributed to what happened between you and Joyce." James nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement, but also taking responsibility for his own choices. "I appreciate that, Dad. But what happened was my fault. I let pressure become an excuse for treating Joyce badly. I made my own choices." "Well, you're making better choices now," his father observed. "That little girl is lucky to have you." But the most meaningful moment came later in the afternoon. James's parents had invited Joyce's family as well. Her parents and siblings had driven in from Chicago. When Joyce's mother arrived and saw the setup, she looked at Joyce with raised eyebrows, questioning. "It's okay, Mom," Joyce assured her. "Things are different now." What transpired was an interracial family reunion unlike any Des Moines had probably seen. James's conservative Iowa relatives mingling with Joyce's vibrant Chicago family, both sides united by their love for a 2-year-old girl who didn't see color or culture, just saw people who loved her. There was still some awkwardness, certainly, Years of cultural differences and past tensions don't disappear overnight. But there was also genuine effort from everyone involved, and Amara served as the perfect bridge, moving from grandmother to grandmother, from uncle to cousin, spreading joy indiscriminately. At one point, Joyce found herself standing under the old oak tree at the edge of the property with James's mother. The older woman turned to her with tears in her eyes. "I was wrong about so many things," she said quietly. "About you, about what matters in a marriage, about what makes a real family, watching you with Amara, seeing the program you've built for those children, hearing James talk about how you raised her alone while he was too foolish to know what he had. Joyce, you're remarkable. You're everything I should have hoped for in a daughter-in-law." Joyce felt her own eyes fill with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." "Do you think," James's mother asked hesitantly, "there's any chance you and James might?" She didn't finish the question, but Joyce knew what she was asking. "I don't know," Joyce answered honestly. "We're taking things slow. We're focusing on being good parents to Amara. The rest, we'll see." As the late summer sun began to set over the farmhouse, James found Joyce standing, by herself, watching both families interact with Amara at the center of it all. He walked over and stood beside her, close but not touching, respecting boundaries that were gradually shifting but still present. "This is nice," Joyce said softly. "It is," James agreed. "Both our families together, supporting Amara. It's what I always hoped for, even if it took a very different path to get here." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and then James turned to face Joyce fully. His heart was pounding because he'd been planning this moment for weeks, trying to find the right time, the right words. "Joyce," he began, his voice nervous but determined, "these past few months with you and Amara have been the happiest of my life. Not because everything's been perfect. It hasn't. Not because it's been easy. It's been really hard sometimes. But because I finally understand what actually matters." Joyce turned to look at him, her expression open but guarded, waiting to hear where this was going. "I love our daughter more than I thought it was possible to love anyone," James continued. "But Joyce, I need you to know that I love you too. I never stopped loving you, even when I was too stupid and proud to show it properly. And I know I don't deserve it, and I know you might not be ready or might never be ready, but I have to ask." James dropped to one knee right there under the oak tree, pulling a small ring box from his pocket. In the distance, family members noticed and started nudging each other, creating a ripple of attention that gradually quieted the entire gathering. But James only had eyes for Joyce. "Joyce," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "you gave me a second chance to be Amara's father, and I'm so grateful for that. Now I'm asking if you'll give me a second chance to be your husband. The husband I should have been from the beginning. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that I've learned what really matters? Will you let me be the partner you deserve, and the father Amara deserves?" Joyce's hand flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Around them, both families had gone completely silent, everyone holding their breath, waiting for her answer. Even Amara seemed to sense something important was happening. Standing, still in her grandmother's arms, watching her parents with wide eyes. Joyce looked at James kneeling before her, vulnerable, hopeful, transformed from the man who'd broken her heart into someone who'd done the hard work of becoming better. She thought about the journey they'd been on, individually and together. She thought about the 18 months of single motherhood, the pain of their separation, the fear she'd carried that he wouldn't want their daughter. She thought about the past few months of watching him show up consistently, of seeing him prioritize Amara over his ego and his business, of witnessing genuine change backed up by sustained action. She thought about Amara and whether reconciling was the right thing for their daughter. But she also thought about herself and what she wanted, what she needed, what she deserved. And she realized that the man kneeling before her had become the man she needed him to be. Not perfect, but committed to growth. Not without flaws, but willing to work on them. "Yes," Joyce said, her voice strong and clear despite her tears. "Yes, James, I'll marry you. James's face transformed with joy and relief. He stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, then wrapped her in his arms, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. Around them, both families erupted in cheers and applause. Amara, not fully understanding what was happening but catching the joy, clapped her little hands together and shouted, "Yay!" making everyone laugh through their tears. James and Joyce kissed under that old oak tree, surrounded by the people who loved them, holding each other like they'd never let go again. It wasn't the same as their first kiss or their first wedding. It was better, built on harder lessons, deeper foundations, real forgiveness and genuine change. "Thank you," James whispered against Joyce's hair. "Thank you for believing in me, for giving me this chance. Thank you for becoming someone worth believing in," Joyce replied. They got married 3 months later in a joyful ceremony that felt more like a celebration of survival and transformation than a traditional wedding. The ceremony itself was held at the Des Moines Art Center where they'd first met, coming full circle to where their story began. But this time, everything was different and better. Joyce walked down the aisle to jazz music, naturally, wearing a stunning dress that made James's breath catch when he saw her. But the most beautiful moment came when little Amara, now 2.5 years old, toddled down the aisle as the flower girl, carrying her basket with intense concentration, leaving a trail of petals and prompting orders from every guest. When she reached the front, she looked up at James and Joyce and announced loudly, "Mama, Daddy, pretty." The laughter and joy that followed set the tone for the entire ceremony. Their vows this time were different too. They'd written them together, and they were honest about the past while hopeful about the future. "I promise to be patient," James vowed, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to value what we have, instead of fixating on what we don't. I promise to communicate, instead of letting frustration build. I promise to be your partner in every sense, through easy times and hard times, through success and failure, through joy and disappointment. I promise to love you for who you are, not for what you can give me. And I promise to be the husband and father our family deserves. I promise to be open," Joyce vowed in return, "even when it's scary. I promise to communicate my needs instead of expecting you to read my mind. I promise to forgive without keeping score. I promise to trust again, even though trust takes time to rebuild. I promise to remember that we're on the same team, always. And I promise to love you through your imperfections, because I know you love me through mine." There wasn't a dry eye in the house. The reception that followed was a perfect blend of both their cultures: jazz, music and gospel, soul food and Iowa comfort food. Joyce's Chicago family, teaching James's Iowa relatives how to do certain dances while everyone laughed, and celebrated this union that had survived separation and emerged stronger. Amara danced with everyone, the center of attention, and clearly loving every minute of it. At one point during the reception, James's business partner approached him with a concerned look. "Hey, I hate to bring this up at your wedding, but we got a call about the Henderson development. There's an issue that needs immediate attention." The old James would have jumped into problem-solving mode immediately, perhaps even stepped away from his own wedding reception to handle it. But the new James looked at his partner and said calmly, "I'm at my wedding. Whatever it is can wait until Monday. We have a capable team that can handle anything urgent." His partner looked surprised, then smiled. "You're right. Sorry for interrupting. Enjoy your day." Joyce had witnessed the exchange from nearby, and when James caught her eye, she smiled at him with such warmth and pride that he felt his chest swell. He was finally getting it right. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, James and Joyce stood together, watching Amara sleeping in her grandmother's arms, exhausted from all the excitement. They were holding hands, Joyce's head resting on James's shoulder, both of them quiet and content. "We made it," Joyce said softly. "We did," James agreed. "And we're going to keep making it, every day, one choice at a time." In the years that followed, James and Joyce built the life they'd always dreamed of, but with a deeper appreciation for what they had, because they knew what it was like to lose it. They never took their happiness for granted. They never let small frustrations build into big resentments. They communicated, sometimes awkwardly but always honestly. They went to couples therapy periodically, not because things were falling apart, but because they wanted to keep things strong. 3 years after they remarried, Joyce gave birth to a baby boy they named Marcus. The pregnancy was joyful rather than stressful because James had done the work on his fertility issues and because both of them had learned patience. When Marcus arrived, James was there for every moment, the middle of the night feedings, the diaper changes, the pediatrician appointments, the exhausting newborn phase. He'd missed all of that with Amara, and he was determined not to miss a second with his son. Amara was an enthusiastic big sister, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to story time. Watching her gentle with her baby brother, James would sometimes get emotional thinking about how easily he could have missed all of this, could have let pride and impatience cost him not just Joyce, but this entire beautiful family they'd created together. James's business continued to thrive, but he ran it differently now. He prioritized family time, delegated more effectively, and focused on projects. That gave back to the community rather than just generating profit. He became known not just as a successful CEO, but as a dedicated father and husband, someone who'd publicly spoken about his past mistakes and his journey to become better. That vulnerability made him more respected, not less. Joyce's art program expanded to serve children across Iowa and eventually drew attention from national education foundations. She was invited to speak at conferences, to consult with other cities starting similar programs, to write about her approach to using art as a tool for empowerment and healing. She balanced her growing professional success with motherhood, and James supported her every step of the way, picking up kids from daycare when she had, evening events, taking over bedtime routines when she needed to prepare for presentations, celebrating her achievements as enthusiastically as she celebrated his. Their home, they'd moved into a house together, something that felt truly like theirs rather than his or hers, was filled with laughter, art projects, jazz music playing softly, and the organized chaos that comes with raising young children. It wasn't always easy. They had disagreements, exhausting days, moments of frustration, but they faced everything as partners, remembering always what they'd survived and learned. One evening, several years after their remarriage, James was tucking Amara into bed. She was 7 now, smart and curious and full of questions about the world. "Daddy," she asked as he pulled the covers up to her chin, "why do you and Mama have 2 wedding days?" James smiled. They'd explained this in simple terms before, but Amara was old enough now to understand more. He sat on the edge of her bed. "Well, sweetheart, Mama and I got married the first time when we were younger, and we loved each other very much, but we made some mistakes and hurt each other. So we took some time apart to grow and learn and become better people. And then you got married again," Amara prompted. "And then we got married again," James confirmed, "because we realized that we loved each other enough to work on our mistakes and try again. Sometimes people need a second chance to get things right." Amara thought about this seriously. "I'm glad you got a second chance," she said finally. "Because I like having you as my daddy." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I like being your daddy," he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "I like it more than anything in the whole world." After tucking both kids in, James found Joyce in their bedroom, looking at old photos. On her phone, pictures from that first charity auction where they'd met, from their first wedding, from the dark period after their separation, from the museum gala where they'd reconnected, from their second wedding, from all the years since. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, sitting beside her on the bed. "I'm thinking about how far we've come," Joyce said. "How many moments we almost didn't have because we let one terrible night define us." "But we didn't let it define us," James said, taking her hand. "We let it teach us instead." Joyce leaned her head on his shoulder, just as she had at their second wedding reception. "Do you ever regret those 2 years we lost?" James considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain we caused each other. I regret not being there when you were pregnant, when Amara was born, for her first year. I can't pretend those aren't real losses." He paused. "But I also don't know if I would have become the man I needed to be without hitting rock bottom. Sometimes we have to lose everything to understand what we had. That's very wise, Joyce teased gently. I learn from the best, James replied, pulling her closer. They sat in comfortable silence, both thinking about the unlikely journey that had brought them back together. Their story wasn't a typical romance where love conquers all effortlessly. It was messier, harder, more real than that. It was a story about failure and redemption, about pride and humility, about breaking and healing. It was a story that proved second chances are possible when both people are willing to do the work. So here's what I want you to think about as this story comes to a close. How many relationships end at the first major failure, at the first devastating fight, at the moment when someone reveals their worst self? How many couples walk away from something that could have been rebuilt, thinking the damage is too severe, the trust too broken, the hurt too deep? James and Joyce could have been one of those statistics. They had every reason to stay apart, the words spoken in anger, the 2 years of separation. The secret of Amara's existence, the layers of hurt and betrayal and disappointment. But they didn't stay apart. They chose differently. They chose to believe that people can change when they're motivated by love and humbled by loss. They chose to forgive without forgetting, to move forward while learning from the past. They chose to give second chances when those chances were earned through consistent action rather than empty promises. And in making those choices, they created something more beautiful and resilient than their first attempt at marriage ever was. Their story teaches us that true love does require patience, not the patience of passively waiting for things to happen, but the patience of actively working toward growth even when it's uncomfortable. It teaches us that pride is one of the most destructive forces in relationships, that we can destroy what we love most by insisting on our own timeline, our own way, our own priorities above our partner's needs. But more than anything, James and Joyce's story teaches us that family isn't built on perfection. It's built on persistence, on showing up even when it's hard, on choosing love, even after that love has been tested and found wanting. It's built on the willingness to say I was wrong and the grace to say I forgive you. It's built on second chances and the courage to take them. The millionaire CEO got the family he longed for, but not in the way he expected. He had to lose everything first. He had to become someone different. He had to learn that a child is a gift, not a goal, and that the journey to fatherhood begins with being a good partner. Joyce found that love can return when you're brave enough to be vulnerable. Again, when you trust your judgment about whether someone is change is real, when you believe that broken things can sometimes be mended into something even stronger than they were before. And Amara and Marcus? They got what every child deserves, 2 parents who love them desperately, who work every day to be better. For them, who model what it looks like to fail and recover, to hurt and heal, to break and rebuild. They got a family that's real and imperfect and beautiful, precisely because it fought its way back from the edge. So, I have one final question for you, and I really want you to think about this, maybe even comment below with your answer. Is there someone in your life you've written off because of past hurts? Is there a relationship you've assumed is beyond repair? Is there a connection you ended that maybe, just maybe, could be rebuilt? If both people were willing to do the genuine work of change, I'm not saying every relationship should be saved. Some need to end for very good reasons. But some, like James and Joyce's, end because of temporary failures rather than fundamental incompatibility. Some end because of pride or fear, or lack of communication, rather than lack of love. And those relationships, the ones where love still exists underneath the hurt, those might deserve a second look. Tell me in the comments, do you believe in second chances? Have you ever given someone a second chance and had it work out, or had it fail? What do you think James and Joyce did right in their reconciliation? What would you do differently? And if this story moved you, if it made you think differently about forgiveness or change, or the possibility of redemption, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel for more stories that make you feel something real, and share this video with someone who might need to hear that second chances are possible when both people are willing to fight for them. Because at the end of the day, that's what this story is really about, fighting for what matters, becoming who you need to be, and believing that broken. Things can be made whole again, not the same as they were, but often stronger, for having been broken and repaired with care, patience, and love. Thank you for listening to James and Joyce's story. Thank you for taking this journey with them, through heartbreak to healing, through separation to reunion, through failure to redemption. May we all have the wisdom to know when to walk away and when to stay and fight. May we all have the courage to change when change is needed. And may we all have the grace to forgive when forgiveness has been earned. Until next time, remember, the best love stories aren't the ones without struggle. They're the ones where both people decide the relationship is worth the struggle. James and Joyce decided their family was worth fighting for, and look what they built from the ashes of what they'd destroyed. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now. Don't wait. Tell me, what was the most powerful moment in this story for you? What lesson will you carry with you? And be honest, if you were Joyce, could you have forgiven James? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you've made it this far, if you've listened to this entire story from beginning to end, you're the real MVP. Hit that subscribe button and that notification bell, because we have more stories like this coming. Stories about real people facing real challenges, making real mistakes, and finding real redemption. Stories that remind us we're all imperfect, we're all works in progress, and we're all capable of becoming better than we were yesterday. This is what real love looks like. Not perfect, but persistent. Not easy, but earned. Not fairy tale, but worth fighting for. See you in the next story.